This lesson contains audio narration. Please connect your headphones, or turn on your speakers. Click on. These are the key objectives that you can expect to achieve after completing this lesson. Describe the control of welding consumables. Determine if a welding procedure specification has been properly qualified. Verify the qualifications of the welder or welding operator. Click the Next button. The control of welding materials is particularly important since there may be several suppliers and several types of consumables used on the shop floor. Welding materials are usually governed by code requirements described in CSA or AWS codes. Fabricators certified in accordance with CSA W47.1 must use certified electrodes and consumables. Electrodes are certified by the Canadian Welding Bureau to CSA W48. Filler metals and allied material for metal arc welding, or AWSA 5. If there is a specific reason to use a non-certified consumable, W47.1 does provide a mechanism for conditional approval based on procedure qualification. CSA W59 requires that welding consumables conform to the requirements of the W48 or AWSA 5 standard. The inspector should verify that the consumables to be used are certified. ASME pressure vessels constructed in accordance with the requirements of Section 8, for example, have no agency to oversee the qualification of welding consumables. However, each electrode manufacturer must have performed tests in accordance with the requirements of the pertinent ASME SFA specification and state conformance of the product to the same standard. The inspector should verify that the label identification on the consumables to be used includes the conformances required by the welding procedure specification. The AWS publishes a wide range of filler metal specifications covering most types of welding consumables, which provides a comprehensive system for electrode classification. These specifications may contain both mandatory provisions, such as chemical and mechanical properties, manufacture and testing, as well as non-mandatory provisions, which provide more information for the user. AWS also publishes the following documents to aid users with the purchase of filler metals: AWS A5.01, Filler Metal Procurement Guidelines provides methods for identification of filler metal components, classification of lots of filler metals and specification of the testing schedule in procurement documents. And the filler metal comparison charts provide lists of manufacturers that supply filler metals in accordance with the various AWS specifications, along with their brand names. Alternatively, the AWS specification, classification and manufacturer of a filler metal can be determined from the brand name. ANSI has approved most AWS filler metal specifications as American national standards, thus allowing them to be adopted by many other standards. When ASME adopts an AWS filler metal specification, it adds the letters SF to the AWS alphanumeric designation. Many standards group electrodes according to an F number. Table 1 shows the F number classification and the corresponding ASME specification number and AWS classification number. When ASME adopts an AWS filler metal specification either in its entirety or with revisions, it adds the letters SF to the AWS alphanumeric designation. Thus, an ASME SFA 5.4 specification would be similar, if not identical, to the AWSA 5.4 specification. The supplier should provide documentation such as a label on the package which shows that the materials meet the standards requirements, classification and certification status. A typical label from a package of SMAW electrodes is shown. Low-hydrogen SMAW electrodes and some SAW fluxes are supplied in sealed packages to prevent them from absorbing moisture from the air. They should be checked to ensure that the packaging is not damaged. SMAW electrodes and SAW fluxes from damaged packages should be reconditioned. CSA W59, for example, requires that low-hydrogen electrodes from damaged packages be reconditioned by baking. Electrode specifications require that holding ovens be used for low hydrogen electrodes to ensure they are dry and retain low hydrogen properties. There should be a procedure to control the issuing of electrodes to welders so that the wrong electrode cannot be used in error. Figure 12 shows a typical holding oven for the storage of low hydrogen electrodes. Note that the maximum temperature at which these ovens operate, while suitable for holding, 120 degrees Celsius minimum, may not be high enough for rebaking electrodes, 260 degrees Celsius or 500 degrees Fahrenheit. If rebaking is contemplated, suitable ovens must be available. The inspector should check on a regular basis that the holding ovens are operating properly and set at the correct temperature. A temperature indicating crayon or electronic temperature measuring device is a useful tool for this. Electrode ovens should be clearly identified as to their contents, and electrodes of different classifications should not be indiscriminately mixed together. Certain electrodes should not be stored under elevated temperature conditions. One critical element of a successful welding operation is the adherence to a proven welding procedure. The purpose of the procedure is to ensure that the welding operation is consistent and executed in a manner that will produce a sound weld. A welding procedure addresses all of the variables that can affect the finished weld and documents them so that they can be repeated. Many contracts require that welding procedures be qualified, to prove the supplier's capability, prior to the issuing of the contract. Qualification of a welding procedure usually involves testing a typical weldment produced according to that procedure to demonstrate that the resulting welds meet prescribed standards. When the material, process and design are common and conform to the procedural requirements of the governing standard, the procedure may be considered pre-qualified, and used without qualification. This is quite common practice in structural applications when welding is done in accordance with AWSD 1.1 or CSAW 59. AWS and ASME publishes standard welding procedure specifications that may be used on work covered by the AWSD 1.1 with the engineer's approval. The National Board Inspection Code has adopted some standard welding procedure specifications for use on ASME boiler and pressure vessel work. However, their use is not permitted for construction where impact testing of the welding procedure specification is required by the Construction Code. Therefore, the standard welding procedure specification may be considered pre-qualified under certain conditions. Fabrication and construction standards require that welding be carried out in accordance with written procedures, and most go on to formalize this requirement by specifying the content and recommending the format of such procedures. Standards might also require that the welding procedure specification be approved by some appropriate body such as the jurisdiction, or the Canadian Welding Bureau. The Boiler and Pressure Vessels Act, for example, typically requires approval by the Chief Inspector. The ASME Boiler Code, Section 9, requires that the fabricator have welding procedure specifications and procedure qualification test reports. In the preparation of a welding procedure specification, the first step is to select the parameters, or variables, to be used for the weld. Possibly arrived at through experimentation, and often from experience, these parameters represent the steps to be taken to produce a sound weld. The qualification test assembly is welded and the parameters recorded on the procedure qualification test report form. Defined test pieces, for example, for bend or tensile strength tests, are then taken from this weld and are subject to mechanical tests. Successful testing then allows the WPS to be created, using the data recorded from the PQR. From tables of variables and allowable ranges, a more general WPS is produced, which allows minor variations in parameters to provide for ease of application when local conditions are different from those in the PQR. For ASME work, the WPS is the document that provides the direction for execution of an acceptable weld. The figures show the front and back of the recommended ASME format procedure qualification record containing the data recorded for a shielded metal arc welding groove weld. The figures show the front and back of ASME Form QW482, The weld procedure specification. Welding procedure specifications are also required for structural types of work. Even though the intent behind the need for a welding procedure specification is generally the same in different application fields, each governing design or workmanship standard may have its own specific requirements. For example, an ASME welding procedure specification would correspond to a welding procedure data sheet in the CSA W59 and W47.1 system. CSA standard W47.1 requires that welding procedure specifications be approved by the Canadian Welding Bureau. The CSA W47.1 system for a welding procedure specification consists, therefore, of two components: a general welding procedure specification and supporting welding procedure data sheets. A welding procedure specification is a written qualified welding procedure prepared to provide direction for making production welds to code requirements. The welding procedure specification or other documents may be used to provide direction to the welder or welding operator to assure compliance with the code requirements. Most standards provide recommended forms for establishing welding procedure specification and procedure qualification test report documents. CSA W47.1 requires that a WPS be approved by the Canadian Welding Bureau. CSA W47.1 has two documents. A WPS which outlines the general requirements and essential variables for a process. One is needed for each process used by the fabricator. The second document is a WPDS which can be compared to ASME AWS WPS. A WPDS contains the specific requirements for a process, joint, position, electrodes, base metals and parameters. The figure shows a sample W47.1 welding procedure specification. A sample W47.1 welding procedure data sheet. After establishing that appropriate welding procedure specifications exist, the inspector must verify that they have been properly qualified and approved. The method of qualification varies with the type of work and governing code or standard. In some cases, new tests are required. In other cases, the results of previous tests can be used, and in structural fabrication pre-qualified procedures can often be used without the need for further testing. But whether or not testing is needed, an approved written welding procedure specification is always required. Let us first consider fabrication by a company certified to CSA W47.1 and welding to CSA W59. If the joint preparations selected follow those of Clause 10 of W59, and if the procedural restrictions of Clauses 5 and 10 of W59 are followed, then the welding procedure is considered pre-qualified. It must still be submitted to the Canadian Welding Bureau, CWB, for approval, but testing is not required. Minimum low-temperature toughness performance is considered an essential variable requiring qualification testing. If the procedure does not comply with the conditions for pre-qualification, or if there are additional requirements such as Sharpie impact properties, then the procedure must be qualified by testing. One of the most important features of the procedure qualification test record is the range of conditions over which the qualification is valid. Materials are usually grouped, and qualification for one material is valid for any material in that same group. And tests on one thickness of material will be valid for a defined range of thicknesses. The figure shows an example of a pre-qualified joint for single bevel groove weld, when back gouged to sound metal, GTSM, for different arc welding processes from CSA W59. Procedures that do not comply with conditions for pre-qualification can be qualified by performing mechanical tests on a procedure qualification test weld. Under CSA, there are two main routes for qualifying procedures as shown in the figure. The construction of pressurized systems, pressure vessels and pressurized piping, falls under separate regulations from structures or machinery. In Canada, the provincial governments have this responsibility. In the United States, The state governments are responsible for the safety of pressurized systems. The responsible authority may elect to delegate the compliance activity to another agency or may police the implementation of the codes themselves. For example, in Ontario the responsibility is delegated to the Technical Standards and Safety Authority, TSSA. In Alberta, the organization delegated is the Alberta Boiler Safety Association, ABSA. Parameters that are considered to have a significant effect on the properties of the resulting welded connections are termed essential variables. The essential variables and their allowable ranges are given in the standards. ASME also uses the term supplementary essential variables for those that are considered to affect notch toughness of the weld. In addition, ASME requires non-essential variables to be listed on the welding procedure specification, although a change in non-essential variables is not considered to affect the mechanical properties of the weld and does not require requalification. One of the most important tasks of the inspector is verifying that the welding operators, welders and the tack welders are qualified for the work at hand. Welding personnel are qualified by undertaking welder performance tests as required by the relevant code. Evidence of qualification is in the form of an identification card, which shows the classification, process, and position for which the individual is qualified. An example of the CWB welder identification card is shown. The Canadian Welding Bureau issues welder identification cards as described in the relevant standard, which defines the elements of welder qualification. Identification cards issued in accordance with the requirements of CSA W47.1, for steel, and W47.2, for aluminum, define qualification by classification, process, mode of process application, filler metal, position, thickness range, and base metals. Two of the classifications used in CSA W47.1 are T, for complete penetration welding of hollow sections from one side without backing. For example, a pipe weld. And S, for welding of plate and rolled or hollow sections either from both sides or from one side with backing. The figure shows the classification of welders according to CSA W47.1. The valid positions of welding are determined by class. Class F, flat position and fillet welds in the flat and horizontal position. Class H, flat and horizontal positions. Class V, flat, horizontal and vertical positions, and Class O, flat, horizontal, vertical and overhead positions. The figure shows position classes for welder qualification according to CSA W47.1. For the purpose of performance qualification, electrodes are grouped such that a welder qualified with one electrode in the group is qualified to weld with other electrodes in the group and possibly with other groups, as shown in Table 2. The grouping is intended to reflect the difficulty of handling the various electrodes. The CSA standard qualification is transferable among certified employers. So welders retain their qualifications if they move to another certified employer. Identification cards have expiry dates, and the inspector must verify that cards are current for the job in hand. It may be necessary to call for re-qualification of the welders and operators. Normally the CSA qualification is valid for 2 years. If the CSA qualification is based on an ASME qualification, for example, then the ticket issued by CWB is only valid until the expiry of the ASME ticket. The figure shows an Ontario Technical Standards and Safety Authority ticket for pressure vessel and pressure piping, ASME, work. Welder qualification card for pressure vessel work, ASME, continued. The figure shows the bottom of the welder qualification card for pressure vessel work, ASME. In AWS welding codes, the welder's qualification shall be considered as remaining in effect indefinitely unless the welder is not engaged in a given process of welding for which the welder is qualified for a period exceeding 6 months. Or, there is any specific reason for a welding authority to question a welder's ability. Depending on the conditions of the qualification tests, there are limitations on the position, type of weld and thickness range that is qualified. The table provides a summary of the ASME Section 9 requirements. Now that we have reviewed the last of the material, let's see what you remember. Click the You have completed this lesson. You should be able to describe the control of welding consumables, determine if a welding procedure specification has been properly qualified, verify the qualifications of the welder or welding operator. Congratulations! You have completed this lesson.